In a striking diplomatic move that underscores the deepening strategic alignment between Moscow and Beijing, Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed Chinese Premier Qiang to the Kremlin this week for high-level talks and major announcements. The visit comes at a moment when both nations are seeking to manage changing global fault lines, and each is looking to leverage closer ties to bolster their own domestic and international agendas. Upon arrival in Moscow, Qiang engaged in a meeting with Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, where he stressed China's intent to intensify cooperation with Russia. He said, "We stand ready to deepen cooperation with Russia in investment, energy, agriculture and other fields." The statement marks a clear signal that Beijing's economic diplomacy in Moscow is entering a new phase. In this role, Qiang is the head of China's State Council and remains firmly placed as the country's second-ranked political leader. In parallel, President Putin announced that Russia will shortly launch a visa-free regime for Chinese travellers, mirroring the pilot scheme China introduced for Russian travellers last month. Putin declared mirror measures will come into force in the very near future for citizens of the People's Republic of China visiting Russia. That announcement formalises an important step in people-to-people diplomacy between the two states and opens new possibilities for tourism, business travel and broadening commercial ties. The two announcements, one economic, the other consular, dovetail in a coordinated diplomatic narrative, Russia and China presenting their bilateral ties as robust, forward-looking and increasingly normalised in key respects. For Moscow, the visa-free regime signals both a goodwill gesture and an economic opportunity. For Beijing, deeper cooperation in energy, agriculture and foreign investment offers a way to diversify its partnerships and ensure greater resilience in a changing global order. From Moscow's side, the timing is apt. Russia's push for alternative markets and increased inward investment has grown more urgent amid Western sanctions and geopolitical isolation. By offering visa-free access to one of the world's largest outbound travel markets, the Kremlin is banking on a surge of Chinese visitors, tourists and business travellers who may also bring capital, partnerships and new commercial flows into Russia. Putin has previously described this step as a friendly act intended to yield very serious effects in the economic and humanitarian sphere. From Beijing's side, Qiang's comments reflect the broader strategy of the Chinese leadership to deepen cooperation, especially in sectors where Russia holds strengths, such as energy and food, agriculture, and where China is seeking stability and supply chain diversification. By embracing a closer Russia link, China both expands its diplomatic space and signals to its business community that Moscow is now a clearer partner. Much of the discussion during the Kremlin visit appears to have revolved around practical measures. Among the items reportedly on the agenda, expanding agricultural trade flows, enabling Chinese enterprises more conveniences to invest and operate in Russia, and lowering systemic frictions in joint projects in energy, infrastructure and technology. Qiang emphasized the need for more convenience for Chinese enterprises in the investment and operation domain, a phrase that suggests China is seeking more than ceremonial ties, but concrete institutional changes. The visa-free arrangement itself is a cornerstone of this partnership. Since 15 September 2025, China has allowed ordinary Russian passport holders to travel visa-free for up to 30 days as part of a one-year trial period. Russia's announcement signals reciprocation and sets in motion a structural adjustment in bilateral mobility. Analysts note the likely ripple effects: increased tourism, boosted cross-border mobility, a welcome uptick for regional economies in Russia's Far East, and enhanced business travel flows for Chinese firms engaged in Russian markets. It is not merely a bilateral handshake, it is a demonstration of the evolving geopolitical architecture. China and Russia are presenting their relationship as not simply tactical, but as operational. New pathways, legal frameworks and institutional linkages. For decades, visa arrangements and consular barriers have been major impediments to full engagement between major powers. By removing them, the two states symbolically elevate their partnership to strategic normalcy. This momentum ties into both countries' broader foreign policy calculus. Russia, facing sustained confrontation with the West and seeking new external anchors, finds in China a partner of scale, one that shares key strategic grievances, e.g. US dominance, constraints on sovereignty, and is willing to coordinate. China, meanwhile, is pursuing multidimensional ties across the globe, seeking to lock in structural relationships that reduce its dependence on any single geography. Moscow thus becomes a counterweight and an avenue. Within China, Qiang has been charged with steering the economy during a period of global and domestic turbulence, from decelerating growth to demographic challenges and shifts in global trade patterns. In this context, external cooperation such as that with Russia provides both symbolic and practical ballast. By emphasizing sectors like agriculture and energy, he is signaling that Beijing's economic agenda is not only export industrial, but also inward-facing and integrative for Russia. The visa-free regime could become a practical engine. Chinese tourists exploring Far Eastern regions, Chinese investment in agriculture and energy, Chinese operational presence in Russian infrastructure projects. If well managed, this could help revitalize Russia's long underinvested regions and diversify its economy away from pure hydrocarbons. However, the venture is not without risk or caveats. Questions remain: how swiftly the Russian side will implement the visa-free regime in practice, how quickly Chinese firms will mobilize resources into Russian markets, how effective the convenience for Chinese enterprises truly becomes, and how Western sanctions or secondary effects may impact such partnerships. Moreover, the mobility surge could expose regional Russian infrastructure bottlenecks and would require coordination at subnational levels: customs, border infrastructure, air travel routes. From a geopolitical lens, these moves may have ripple effects. A deepened China-Russia alignment could accelerate shifts in Eurasian trade corridors, challenge Western-led economic constructs, and bolster the vision of a multipolar world order, one in which bilateral mega-partnerships, rather than multilateral institutions dominated by the West, play a central role. In that sense, the visa-free travel announcement is more than a tourism convenience. It is part of a larger strategic framing of Sino-Russian cooperation. One high-profile takeaway: mobility matters. The removal of visa barriers often signals trust, long-term commitment, and institutional investment. By opening doors to more Chinese citizens in Russia, the Kremlin is essentially betting on the Chinese market size and its willingness to travel, invest, and engage economically. Simultaneously, Beijing is sending a message to its domestic business audience: Russia is open, accessible, and a legit market partner. In the broader conversation of global diplomacy, this shift intersects with other threads. China has in recent years expanded its unilateral visa-free policies for citizens from dozens of countries, including European nations, Australia, New Zealand, and others. Extending its global reach, Russia's reciprocal move helps seal the circle in the bilateral space, but also signals to third-party states that Moscow is diversifying away from the West and strengthening East Asian ties. For both countries, there is a domestic optics dimension. In China, showing forward momentum in foreign partnerships supports the narrative of opening up, economic opportunity, and international leadership. In Russia, using China as a partner reinforces the messaging that Russia remains a major power with strong state-to-state connections beyond the West. The visit of Qiang to Moscow and the joint announcements thus serve both foreign policy and domestic political functions. At the Kremlin, President Putin's hosting of the Chinese premier underscores the importance Moscow attaches to the bilateral link. It also adds to the visual of Russia anchoring itself into the Asia-Pacific. Rather than remaining a purely Eurasian or post-Soviet actor, Li's presence in Moscow, rather than a shorter stopover, signals that China is treating Russia as an operational partner, not simply a rhetorical one. For analysts and observers, a key question will be implementation. Will the visa-free regime rapidly translate into flows of Chinese travelers into Russian cities and regions? Will Russian border infrastructure be upgraded? Will Chinese businesses, particularly those in energy, agriculture, and infrastructure, actually scale operations in Russia? And will regulatory and institutional reforms follow through such that the more convenience Li mentioned materializes into actual changes? For example, easier licensing, fewer bureaucratic obstacles, improved protections for Chinese investment. The success of the announcement depends on these follow-throughs. In sum, the visit of Qiang to Moscow and the twin announcements, deepening economic ties and visa-free travel, reflect a strategic pivot in Sino-Russian relations, a shift from rhetoric to action. The two states are signaling that their partnership is not just about high-level summits or military coordination, but about concrete mobility, economic integration, and institutional linkages. If the implementation is sustained, the impact could be significant, both in bilateral terms and in the broader global order. But much will depend on how rapidly the gesture becomes reality, how well the bureaucratic and infrastructure constraints are addressed, and how external pressures and sanctions are managed. In the coming weeks and months, attention will focus on how Russian carriers, border officials and tourism agencies respond, whether Chinese travel agencies start marketing Russian destinations in scale, whether investment memoranda turn into signed projects, and how this fits into the larger architecture of Sino-Russian cooperation, including energy pipelines, agricultural supply chains, and joint infrastructure projects. The Moscow welcome and the outreach from Beijing thus mark a new chapter, not only in China-Russia relations, but perhaps in how major powers frame partnerships in a world of shifting alliances and contested economic systems. For those tracking global diplomacy, the dual announcements offer a lens into how state-to-state ties are being repositioned for the decade ahead, and how mobility, often taken for granted, is now emerging as a strategic lever in major power politics.